Good morning. My name's Sarah and I work for the Anne Frank Trust, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you to this online learning event for Holocaust Memorial Day 2021. Here at the Anne Frank Trust, we have a vision for a society free from prejudice and discrimination, and it's through working with you, young people, that we hope to achieve that. Now, today is a very important day. Today marks 76 years since the liberation of Auschwitz. Some of you may know about Auschwitz, some of you may have never heard that word before, but Auschwitz was one of many camps that the Nazis used as a place to persecute and systematically kill many millions of people many years ago. These people include the Jews, homosexuals, gypsies, and political prisoners. And so it is very important that we take time every 27th of January to reflect on what happened, to remember and honour those victims, and to think about how we can make a difference to make sure these things don't happen again. Some of the things you might hear today might be a bit uncomfortable and might be difficult, but that's okay. It's okay to find some of these situations difficult to digest. And if anything that you hear today is challenging and upsetting, talk to somebody, talk to a teacher. And if you're a teacher, talk to us and we will talk you through this. I am absolutely thrilled that today we are going to be hearing from Eva Clarke. Eva Clarke has a very unique, personal and powerful story about how she survived the Holocaust. Now, Eva, as she will tell you herself, was born in a concentration camp literally a few weeks before it was liberated. Now, for those of you who are a bit younger and maybe don't know what the word liberated means, it means to be freed. So when the camp was freed from the Nazis. So I'm going to hand over to Eva in a moment, and she's going to talk to you about her experiences from obviously from when she was born to now, and how that experience that her family went through has shaped her life. And then if you have questions, we will be taking some questions at the end. The event will be about an hour, but we will allow for an extra 15 minutes of questions at the end. If you've got to go back to another online lesson, that's absolutely fine. Get your comments or questions posted in the comment section and we will ask them to Eva. And then you can watch this recording back to see how she answers if you've got to go and do another lesson. We are really grateful to have so many of you joining us today. Please do make sure that you put your comments in the comments function and do enjoy listening to Eva. So it gives me absolute great pleasure now to hand over to Eva and let her share her story with us all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. Sarah, sorry. I'm very grateful to be given this opportunity to speak to so many students all at once. It is one of the miracles of Zoom. So, Andy, could you please put up my first, not the first photograph, the second one, which is the map, please. Thank you. Now, I am here today because I'm a survivor of the Holocaust. I am a survivor, but only just. Because, as Sarah said, I was born in a concentration camp right at the very end of the Second World War. But that comes right at the very end of my story. And I start my story with this map you can see on the screen. This is a map that shows all the main concentration camps and death camps that existed in Nazi-occupied Europe during the Second World War. It doesn't show all the camps by any means because there were hundreds. What it does show are all the death camps, the red ones. Everywhere where you see the Nazi emblem, the swastika, there you see a name, and that name indicates either a transit camp, a slave labor camp, a concentration camp, or a death camp. And the three camps that my family were involved in are the three names you can see in boxes. The first one is called Theresienstadt. That is the German word for a town in a country that used to be called Czechoslovakia and is now called the Czech Republic. It means the town of Teresa. It was named after former empress of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Maria Theresa. But when I talk about it, I tend to use its Czech name, which is Terezín, simply because my mother was Czech, and I find it less of a mouthful than saying Theresienstadt. The second place I hope you will have all heard of, that is the Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp in Poland. But the third one, Mauthausen, I very much doubt whether you've heard of, and that is in Austria. Now, there's a second reason why I use this particular map, and that is to bring to your attention the inset in the circle in the top left-hand corner, where you can see a map of part of the British Isles. And there you can also see a swastika. The swastika is over the Channel Islands, over Jersey and Guernsey and Alderney, because they were invaded by the Germans. There were Jewish people living there, and they were either imprisoned on the islands or they were sent to concentration camps in Europe. So that shows you how closely the whole thing came to mainland Britain. Next picture, please. Now, because I'm telling you a family story, it comes naturally to me to show you family photographs. And this is a photograph of my German family. My father was German but Jewish. It has an interesting place and date. It is Berlin in 1913, so just 1 year before the start of the First World War. And the next photograph will show you, it's the same photograph, but you will see some people highlighted. And the adults in the background, my grandparents, Louis and Selma, and in the foreground are their 3 children, Rolf, Marga, and Bernd. And the little boy on the right-hand side, Bernd, is my father. Now, in 1933, when Hitler came to power in Germany, all those 3 children were by then grown up. And they all realized that it would be advisable if they could get out of Germany. Next picture, please. And the first one to leave was my Uncle Rolf. He left Germany, and first he went to live in Holland, where he met and married a Dutch lady who was also Jewish. And when the Germans invaded Holland, they managed to escape to Switzerland, Switzerland being a neutral country during the Second World War. And there my uncle joined this army. I wonder if you recognize uniforms, the American Army. And after the war, he was very proud of this photograph. He would say to us, you know, look at me in GI uniform in front of, in quotes, my Jeep. So they were safe. Next picture, please. My father's sister, Marga, she and her husband and my cousin, they left Germany quite late in December of 1938. But nevertheless, they managed to get on a ship that was headed for Sydney in Australia. So they were safe. My cousin was about 5 years of age at the time, but I don't happen to have a photograph of him at that age. Here, I think he's graduating from medical studies at Sydney University. And I'm glad to say he is alive. I hope he's well. And he is in his mid-80s now. Next picture, please. My own father, he left Germany in 1933. And he managed to get to Prague, the capital of Czechoslovakia. He thought that was far enough to be safe. It wasn't, but if he hadn't have come to Prague, he wouldn't have met my mother, and I would not be talking to you today. Now, I like to think of this as being my sort of star photograph. I hope you might agree with me by the time you've seen them all. This is a photograph of my parents on their wedding day. They were married on the 15th of May, 1940, which was already under Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia. My father had been an architect and interior designer, and when he first came to Prague, he managed to get a job working for a furniture manufacturer. And initially, he was employed to build film sets at the Barrandov Film Studios, which are still there. My mother had been a law student at the Charles University, but when the Germans invaded, they closed all the Czech universities, and nobody was allowed to study. So she decided she was going to try to find a job that had more sort of immediate practical use. And she decided to become apprenticed to a milliner. I just wonder if any of you happens to know what a milliner is. It's not a word we use very often now. A milliner is a hat maker. Now, you may think that's quite a strange thing to learn how to do. You wouldn't have thought there'd be much demand. But I can assure you, in the 1940s, women always wore hats, even if they just went down to the local shops. They'd be sort of properly turned out. And it was the same in this country as well. Now, when the Germans invaded any country, they immediately imposed various rules and regulations upon Jewish people. And there are hundreds and hundreds of those rules and regulations, and they all come under the general heading of the Nuremberg laws. I will tell you of just a few to give you an idea. First and foremost, Jewish people immediately lost their citizenship. They were no longer allowed to vote. No intermarriage was allowed between Jewish people and those of other faiths. There was a curfew. Jews were not allowed to go out in the evening. They were only allowed to go to the shops at certain times of the day, invariably the late afternoon, when there would have been as little fresh produce available as possible. Jewish people were immediately thrown out of the professions. They could no longer be doctors, lawyers, teachers. Jewish people were no longer allowed to keep animals. They had to hand them in. They were no longer allowed to keep their cars or their bicycles. They were no longer allowed to keep their telephones or their radios. There were no televisions. They were also forbidden to go to parks, swimming pools, theatres, concerts, cinemas. All those things were forbidden. Their lives were meant to be more and more restricted within their own communities. But because none of these restrictions in itself, at least initially, was life-threatening, so sometimes people tended to test them, especially young people. I'm sure you've all experienced it. I know I have. If you are told you're forbidden to do something, well, your gut reaction is to go and do it. Whether you actually do is another matter. And one day, my mother decided that she was going to go to the cinema despite the fact that it was forbidden. She was sitting in the cinema watching the film when the Gestapo came in, the secret police. They came in, they stopped the film, and they started to go through the audience, row by row, looking at their identification papers. And my mother was terrified because she had no idea how they would react when they got to her and when they saw the large J for Jew on her papers. And they got to about halfway through the auditorium and they stopped, but they left the cinema. And they had stopped just one row in front of where my mother had been sitting. And boy, did she breathe a sigh of relief. And ever since she told me about this, I was always trying to get her to remember what on earth the film was that made her take such a risk. She also would have dearly liked to have known what it was, but it was such a frightening experience, and it was the first. Far worse was to come, but she didn't know that. It was such a frightening experience that she obviously blanked out that memory and she never remembered. But what I can tell you is that when we first came to the UK and when I was safely in school, trying to learn English as quickly as possible, I think my mother used to go to the cinema every single day. And that was fantastic light relief for her after her wartime experiences. She just had this need. It was, it was almost like an obsession to catch up with the frivolous things of life. Next picture, please. Now, one of the later restrictions that was imposed upon Jewish people that you may well know about was the fact that they had to wear a yellow star. And although this is quite a dark photograph, you can see the stars clearly on their coats. This is a photograph of my mother's older sisters, Dena and her friend Herbert. I have a genuine yellow star to show you. This is a genuine yellow star. I hope it's, wait a minute, I'll just take it out of the cover because I can see the reflection. So I hope, whoops, that way. I hope you can see this clearly. This is a genuine yellow star. It has the word Jude on it, which means Jew in German. And everybody in a family had to wear the yellow star every time they went outside their own front door. You had to buy as many yellow stars as there were members of the family aged 6 and above. And my mother distinctly remembered what she was wearing the first time she ever had to wear one of these. She was wearing a dark green skirt, a tan suede jacket, hat, gloves, and she was going to the shops. She said it actually didn't look that bad on the suede jacket, but nevertheless, she was very, very apprehensive. She was very worried as to how people might react to her. But every time my mother went outside wearing the yellow star, nothing ever happened to her. People just ignored it. And that was the best possible news. Nobody pointed at her. Nobody laughed at her. Nobody was rude to her. Nobody spat at her. All those things happened to other people, but it never happened to my mother. We speculated as to why not. And all she could think was, she was a young woman. She was full of self-confidence. and she wasn't going to be cowed. She wasn't going to be bullied by anybody. And I think the fact that she wasn't a bad looker must have helped. Now, there's a second reason why I use this particular photograph, and that is simply to show you that they are smiling. They are smiling because they were out for a walk, obviously before curfew. They were engaged to be married. They were happy. And I assume at the instant that the photograph was taken, they had forgotten that they were wearing the yellow star, with any implication that it might have for them in the future. And very fortunately for them, they had absolutely no idea what was to come. And I will tell you about them later. Next picture, please. My mother had another sister, and her name was Ruja. Ruja means rose. And this is my Aunt Rose with my cousin Peter when he was about 5. And the next photograph will show you Peter, a bit older, with a photograph of his father, my Uncle Tom. And I wonder if any of you might know what the uniform is that he's wearing. My Uncle Tom is wearing the British Army uniform. And the reason for that is, in 1939, he managed to escape from occupied Czechoslovakia. He got to the UK, he joined the Free Forces. He also managed to get a visa for his wife and for his child. But tragically, my aunt refused to come. And the reason she refused to come was because basically it was a very unhappy marriage. And she said to her husband, she said, no, we'll be fine. We'll stay with my parents, with her parents, my grandparents. And that was the attitude of an awful lot, I would say the majority of Jewish people in occupied countries, because initially nobody had any idea whatsoever that they might be sent away anywhere, let alone to something called a slave labor camp, a concentration camp, or a death camp. They had no idea. They just thought if they kept a low profile, more or less stuck to those rules and regulations, they'd be okay. That is human nature. You hope for the best. And again, I'll tell you what happened to them later on. Yes, some people escaped. Yes, some people were hidden, but they were by far in the minority. Next picture, please. Now, this is an aerial photograph of this place called Theresienstadt or Terezin. It is about 40 miles outside of Prague, and before the war, it was a garrison town where Czech soldiers were stationed. But when the Germans invaded, the Czech army was disbanded, and the Germans turned this place into a ghetto and a concentration camp. And Jewish people from all over Europe were sent there in their thousands. And when I was growing up and I was asking my mother, how she was taken prisoner, because I had various images in my mind. I'd read the Diary of Anne Frank, I'd seen films, I'd seen documentaries. And I had this image in my mind, perhaps at 3 o'clock in the morning, there would have been soldiers banging on the doors, soldiers with guns and dogs, dragging people out of their beds. And I said to my mother, is that what happened to you? She said, no, nothing like that. She said, we received a card in the post, and the card said that on a certain day at a certain time, we would have to report to a warehouse in Prague near one of the mainland railway stations. And that's what happened. At the end of November, the beginning of December of 1941, my father received his card and he left. You were told you could take a small suitcase. You were advised to take warm clothing. You were also advised to take a few pots and pans, which indicated to them that they were going somewhere where they would be able to cook, they'd be able to look after themselves. And they assumed that they were being sent to some sort of labor camp. And a few days later, my mother received her card and she left. And not only was she carrying her handbag and her suitcase, she was also carrying a large cardboard box. And I said to her, what on earth did you have in the box? Didn't you have enough to worry about, enough to carry? And she said, well, I think I had between 2 or 3 dozen donuts in the box. And I said, why donuts? And she said, well, your father liked donuts. And it was a very sensible thing to do, as she had no idea where the next meal was coming from. So she was bringing food, just happened to be donuts. And I said to her, did they get to him? She said, yes, they weren't terribly fresh anymore, but they're perfectly edible. And he was pleased. Now, my mother had to spend 3 days and 3 nights in that warehouse with hundreds and hundreds of other people. They were given hardly any food or water. They had to sleep on the floor. And at the end of those 3 days, they were marched to the railway station. And the route was lined with young German officers, 18, 20-year-olds. And there was one young German officer who knew he had a bit of power. Sorry, that's my phone. I'll ignore it. And there was one young German officer, as I said, who knew he had a bit of power. And he, right, it's gone to the answer machine. Yeah, and he used it. He didn't harm my mother physically. He was just a bit sarcastic with words. I will say what he said in German. I will then translate it, but I apologize for the swear word. That's what he said. This soldier could see that my mother was having great difficulty, not only carrying her luggage, but also carrying the box with the donuts. You know, cake boxes haven't changed much since. They're some made of cardboard, or nowadays they'd be tied together with ribbon, not with string. And after 3 days, the moisture from the donuts was making the cardboard soften. So the whole box was coming apart. It was coming adrift. And this soldier could see that my mother was having great difficulty with it. And he said to her, "Es ist scheißegal, ob die Schachtel mitkommt," which means I couldn't give a ... if that box goes with you or not, implying that it wasn't going to do her much good where she was going. Now, he couldn't have had any idea whatsoever what was going to happen to her. All he knew was that it wasn't going to be anything good, and he just wanted to, you know, be sarcastic. Anyway, she ignored him. She got on the train. She arrives in Terezin. Next picture, please. I'm now going to show you 2 drawings of Terezin because I think they are more evocative of the sort of place that it was at the time. These drawings were done secretly by professional artists who themselves were prisoners, and they were discovered after the end of the war, quite by chance. They were discovered buried under the floorboards and in cracks in the walls. And I use this particular picture to try to give you the impression of a very crowded place, because before the war, when it was a Czech garrison town, there would have been a few thousand soldiers stationed there. But during the war, when it was a ghetto and a concentration camp, there were thousands and thousands and thousands of people cramped into very, very crowded conditions. Next picture, please. And on the inside, it looked like this. People basically lived on bunks. They would try to make a niche, a den for themselves with a few personal belongings that they had been able to bring. And when families first arrived in Terezin, that is the first time that those families would have been split up. So men were sent to one part, women to another part, elderly people to another part, children to yet another part. They were able to meet up sometimes during the day, but to a large extent they led separate lives. And when my mother arrived in Terezin, she was fortunate enough to be given a job. The jobs weren't paid or anything, but life was a bit easier if you had a job. And her job was working for the man who had the responsibility for sharing out the food. There wasn't much food there, but what there was, they tried to share out in a fair fashion. And that meant that she had access to food. And when I say she had access to food, she would steal. She would steal a potato, a carrot, an onion, just something with which to make a more substantial soup. And that was literally of vital importance, because at one time my mother had the responsibility every single day for trying to find food for 15 members of her close family every single day. That was her main worry. How on earth was she going to find enough food for all those people? And that was quite apart from the greater worry as to what on earth was going to happen to them all in the future. Next picture, please. And amongst the people she was trying to find food for were her parents, my grandparents, Ida and Stanislav. And the next photograph, please, shows my father as a young man with his mother, Selma. And the next picture, please, shows his father, my grandfather, Louis. Now, my grandfather, Louis, was the only one of my 4 grandparents to have survived the war. And we believe there is a specific reason for that, although we don't actually have any proof. I told you at the beginning that my father was German. His father was German. In the First World War, my grandfather was in the German army. In the First World War, my grandfather was given the Iron Cross First Class. That is the highest military honor that the Germans bestow upon their soldiers. What happens to him in the Second World War? He's thrown into a concentration camp, and most of his family is killed. My grandfather was not sent east. To be sent east was a euphemism, another way of saying you're going to be sent to the Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp. He remained in Terezin throughout the war, and at the end of the war, he was found to be alive, just about. And via the Red Cross, contact was made between him and my uncle and aunt, who by that stage had returned from Switzerland to Holland. And one day there was a knock on the door, and there was my grandfather in the rags that he stood up in, and he lived with them for the rest of his life. And when I was a little girl, we used to go and visit them quite often, and it was very sad, because I would come into the room and my grandfather couldn't see me, because he had been blinded by the gas in the First World War. And he couldn't speak to me, because he spoke German and Dutch, and I only spoke Czech and English. But nevertheless, I'd come into the room, I'd give him a kiss, I'd say, "Hello, grandfather." And he knew that I was the only surviving child in the family. Next picture, please. Now, this photograph may be familiar to some of you. It shows you the gateway to the Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp in Poland. But before I start that part of the story, I have to tell you about two other things that happened to my parents in Terezin. To a large extent, Terezin was a transit camp for the death camps, because there were various categories of people who would have been sent to their deaths quite quickly. And amongst those groups of people would have been the old, the sick, mothers with children, pregnant women, the mentally disabled, the physically disabled. They would have been sent to their deaths quite quickly. But because my parents were young, strong, and well capable of work, so they remained in Terezin for 3 years. That's a remarkably long, very unusually long period of time. You know, just think back 3 years in your lives. It's a long time. And my mother said, luck had an awful lot to do with it. But at the end of September of 1944, their luck ran out, because it was on that day that my father was sent to Auschwitz. And incredibly, my mother actually volunteered to follow him the very next day. And the reason she volunteered to follow him was because she had no idea where he'd been sent. And being the eternal optimist, she thought, well, as they had survived 3 years up to that point, she thought, well, nothing could get any worse. Little did she know, but she thought nothing could get any worse. They would survive. But in fact, she never, ever saw my father again. And she heard from an eyewitness, a friend, quite soon after the end of the war, that my father had actually been shot dead on a death march near Auschwitz on the 18th of January 1945, and Auschwitz was liberated by the Russian army on the 27th of January 1945. And today is the 27th of January, and that is why we commemorate Holocaust Memorial Day today. Now, the other thing that I have to tell you is pretty important, I'm sure you will appreciate, because it concerns my brother and his conception, me and my conception. I told you that when families first came into Terezin, the sexes were segregated, men from women. Well, in 1943, my mother discovered that she was actually pregnant. When I was about, 11, 12, no doubt when it would have been at its most embarrassing. Well, it's embarrassing at any age. I said to her, "So how come you got pregnant? You went with my father." And she replied in a very clever way. She said, "Well," she said, "it was very, very, very dangerous. But your father and I got together secretly, as and when we could, and to hell with the consequences. End of story." But it was not the end of the story, and it had very, very serious consequences, because to become pregnant in a concentration camp was considered by the Nazis to be a crime punishable by death, because they were trying to annihilate, they were trying to murder every single member of the Jewish people. They couldn't prevent women coming into the camps pregnant, but the reason for the segregation was so that they could not become pregnant while there. And when the Nazis discovered that my mother and 4 other women were also pregnant, they made these 5 couples sign a document that said that when the babies were born, they would have to be handed over to be killed. Except they didn't use the word kill, they used the word euthanasia. My mother never heard the word euthanasia. She had to go and ask somebody what it meant. If you look it up in a dictionary, it'll say something like mercy killing. This would not have been mercy killing. This would have been murder. In the event the other 4 babies were born, we don't actually know what happened to those families. We assume they all perished in Auschwitz. When my brother, Jiří means George, He was born in February of 1944. He was not taken away from my parents, but he actually died of pneumonia 2 months later. And his death meant my life and my mother's life, which is a very strange thing to say. But it is true, because had my mother arrived in the Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp holding my brother in her arms, she would have been sent straight to the gas chamber. But because she arrived in Auschwitz not holding my brother, and although she was pregnant again, this time with me, nobody knew. She knew, but nobody else knew, and it didn't show because it was very, very early on. So again, she lived to see another day. Now, you may have seen photographs or films of how people were transported to the death camps. They were sent on trains, but these trains didn't consist of ordinary carriages. These trains consisted of cattle trucks that were so crowded that people couldn't even sit down. There was hardly any air. There might have been a slat open at the top, and that was all. They were given no food and no water, and sometimes these journeys took several days. There were no toilet facilities. There might have been a bucket, which would have been totally inadequate very quickly. So by the time the trains actually arrived in Auschwitz, invariably the people inside them would have been in a very poor mental and physical condition, especially the elderly and the children, because they had the least resistance, the least stamina. Auschwitz itself consisted of several different camps. Auschwitz I was brick-built, and that is where all the Polish prisoners were sent. And that is where today it is not only a place of memorial, but also a museum where you have the collections of luggage, the collections of shoes, the collections of hair, the collections of spectacles, the collections of pots and pans. All those things are in Auschwitz I. But this, Auschwitz II, Auschwitz-Birkenau, is purely a place of memorial. This is where all the Jews were sent and where all the Roma and Sinti were sent. And this photograph was taken at the end of the war. The next photograph, please, shows you what it looks like today behind that gateway. This is a vast area right back to the tree line that would have been filled with wooden huts, such as you can see in the foreground. But because Auschwitz-Birkenau was not preserved in any way until many years later, most of those wooden huts just disintegrated, or the wood was stolen as firewood after the war. But what you can see in the distance, quite accidentally, makes for a very poignant, a very sad memorial to all those thousands and thousands of people who died, who were killed there. Because those uprights you can see in the distance, they are brick chimneys. They are nothing whatsoever to do with the crematorium, but they are brick chimneys. Because inside each hut, you would have had 2 of those chimneys, and they would have been joined by a brick tunnel. There was a grate at either end. And the idea was that you'd have fuel that you burn in the grate, and the heat generated would pass along the tunnel, thereby giving some warmth to the hut. But of course, they weren't given any fuel. Their lives were meant to be at all comfortable. So as I say, it is a very sad memorial because there are hundreds of those brick chimneys. Now, when the trains arrived in Auschwitz and when the people had to get off the trains, that is the first time that they had to go through what was called a selection. And selection always meant life or death. And my mother managed to get through a selection because she was still considered to be strong enough for work. And this was, despite the fact she'd been somewhat malnourished during the previous 3 years. To give you an idea of my mother's physical strength, when she was 14 years of age, she was school's junior backstroke swimming champion of Czechoslovakia. So that gives you an idea of her physical strength. And she always maintained that if this whole experience had to happen to her, she was at the right age, not only physically, but psychologically and emotionally. She was in her mid-20s, she was tough, she was strong. Yes, I just forgot what I was going to say next. Right, so the selections, if you got through a selection, various procedures happened to you. First of all, if you'd managed to bring any luggage with you, you were told to put your suitcase on the ground, to write your name on it, that you would be reunited with it later. Well, of course they weren't. They then were sent into real showers. Well, at this stage, they had absolutely no idea at all that anything other than a real shower existed, a gas chamber. They then had all their hair shaved. They then were given that sort of striped uniform and a pair of shoes, if they were lucky. And then they were tattooed with a number on their arms. And after that, they were sent into these huts. Next picture, please. And on the inside, it looked like this. These huts were incredibly crowded. Some of them before the war might have been stables that would have housed, say, 60 or 70 horses. But at the time that I'm talking about, they housed hundreds and hundreds of people, 500, 800, even up to 1,000 people. And when my mother and her friends arrived in a hut like this, they were so frightened and so bewildered. They just couldn't work out what this place was. And they said to the women there, what happens here? What goes on here? When will we see our families again? And the women actually laughed at them because they couldn't understand that anybody arriving in Auschwitz would have no idea what went on there. And they said, well, we'll all go up in smoke and you never see your families again. And in that instant, they knew what went on there. People were given hardly any sustenance on a daily basis. They were given a liquid, a black oily liquid in the morning, which was called coffee. And they were given another liquid in the evening, which was called soup. And if they're very lucky, perhaps they might have been able to dredge up the odd potato peeling from the bottom of the bucket. And they were given one piece of bread. That is all they were given. So an awful lot of people just died of starvation, and you would often wake up in the morning to find corpses on either side of you. Now, apart from the selections, the other thing that happened on a daily basis was called the appel. Appel means registration. It sounds like a very mild sort of word, doesn't it? You've all been through some form of registration today. What it actually meant was that every day at 4 o'clock in the morning and 6 o'clock in the evening, everybody would have to stand outside their hut to be counted. And if the numbers didn't tally, they would just have to stand there till they did, or until there was some sort of explanation. And my mother said it was very, very hard to stand stock still for hours and hours on end, regardless the weather. And you tried to keep as low a profile as you could because you had no idea how the Nazis might react to you if for some reason you drew attention to yourself. And my mother actually fainted several times during these appels, and that could have been very bad news for her. But she was always so relieved to find that when she came round, to find that she was actually being held up by her friends on either side, which meant that she hadn't slipped to the ground, she hadn't drawn attention to herself, and again, she lived to see another day. Next picture, please. Now this shows you a selection. In the far distance, that long row of people, they are walking to the gas chambers, to their deaths, but they don't know that. In the foreground, the longer row of people are men, the shorter row are women, and they are walking towards a group of Nazi officers where they will be selected for life or for death. And my mother distinctly remembered one of these selections where Dr. Mengele was presiding. Dr. Mengele was one of the most notorious Nazi officers. He was a medical doctor who actually specialized in appalling experiments upon sets of women, upon sets of twins, upon pregnant women, just dreadful. And my mother remembered hearing him say, "Diesmal sehr gutes Material," which means this time we have very good material in front of us, not people, units of slave labor. They did not consider the people in front of them as being human beings. Tell me, can you hear a drill outside? Because if so, I'll close the window. Or is it okay? It's now stopped, sorry. Okay, so where am I? Now, all the rest of my family, except for my one grandfather and my own parents, all the rest of them were sent to Auschwitz a long time before my own parents were. And when they arrived in Auschwitz, none of those initial procedures took place. They were able to keep their luggage, they kept their clothes, they weren't shaved, they weren't tattooed. And they were sent to what was called a Familienlager. That meant a family camp. All it meant was that there were one or two of those huts that had families together. And there was just one very cynical reason why. And that was so that they could be forced to write postcards home. Next picture, please. Now, my aunt, the lady wearing the yellow star in that earlier photograph, she wrote this postcard to her cousin, who still happened to be in Prague. Next picture, please. This shows you the text of the photograph. Some of you may be able to read it. I will read you the English translation. It had to be written in German so the Germans could censor it. You can see the date, the 20th of October, 1943. It starts off with the words, meine Lieben, my dear ones. I am here with my husband, my sister, and my nephew. All are well and in good health. My husband received a parcel yesterday from our housekeeper, and I would ask you to confirm this to her. Please also thank Gerdy. Could she greet Birza Schmidt for us? I hope you're well and happy. Your parents were very well at the time of our departure. Write soon. Peter looks well. Peter's my 8-year-old cousin. Peter looks well and looks forward to receiving news from you. Greetings and kisses, yours, Dana. I imagine that you will agree with me that that basically sounds like, having a wonderful time, wish you were here. And my aunt was desperate to get a message out in code. She got the message out. It was understood. It was acted upon. Next picture, please. In the top left-hand corner, you can see the sender's full name, Sidonie Isidore. She'd married that man in the first photograph. Underneath that is her birthday, the 21st of March, 1904. Underneath that, it says Birkenau. I don't know if any of you noticed the first name of the lady to whom it was sent. Her name was Olga. The word Olga does not feature in the address. Where the word Olga should be is the word Lechem, which is not German. The word Lechem is the Hebrew word for bread. And my aunt was telling her cousin they were starving. Her cousin understood. Her cousin sent a parcel. But the contents of it would have been stolen long before it got anywhere near them. And I'm afraid I have to tell you that even before the postcard was sent from Auschwitz to Prague, they were all dead. All of them. Now, because my mother was still strong enough for work, she was sent out of Auschwitz. Next picture, please. She was sent to a slave labor camp, to an armaments factory in a place called Freiburg in Germany near Dresden, where she thought she was working on this. This is the V1, the unmanned flying bomb. Here it was nicknamed Doodlebug. And when my mother and the other women arrived in the factory, the very first impression they had was one of bedbugs. The place was crawling on the floor, on the walls, on the ceiling. And they were delighted, and I'm sure you can't guess why. They were delighted because it meant there was warmth there and there was food. Not much of either, but there was some. After a few days, they weren't quite so pleased and the bugs started to bite them. But after what they had experienced in Auschwitz, it was negligible. Also, they very quickly ascertained that there were no gas chambers there. Unknown to my mother, she was to spend the next 6 months in Freiburg. That is from October of 1944 to the end of March, the beginning of April of 1945. And the end of the war in Europe was the 8th of May. And during those 6 months, my mother was becoming progressively more and more starved and more obviously pregnant, which was very, very dangerous for her. But fortunately, none of the Germans realized she was pregnant until it was too late to send her back to Auschwitz because Auschwitz had been liberated. We do know of cases of pregnant women who were sent back before liberation, and Mengele took the most unspeakable revenge on them because he felt they'd got away with it. And during the 6 months that my mother was in Freiburg, that is when the Allied bombing raids of Dresden took place. I don't know if you know anything about the Dresden raids. There's been a lot of controversy about them since the war. But I hope that you will appreciate that in this particular context, I'm talking to you from my mother's very, very personal perspective. And from her perspective, the raids were just fantastic. What happened when the raids started was the Germans locked all the prisoners in the factory and they went to the air raid shelters. And the prisoners, even though they knew the next bomb could fall on them and kill a lot of them, nevertheless, they were very pleased because they realized it was the Allies and they hoped and prayed that it wouldn't be too much longer before they were actually rescued. Next picture, please. And this is where my father-in-law comes into the story very, very indirectly. My father-in-law, Kenneth Clarke. He came from the Welsh Herefordshire border. He was in the RAF. He was a navigator. He was in Bomber Command, and he was on the Dresden raids. And after the war, when he first met my mother, well, a long time after the war, when my husband and I became engaged and the two families got together, and when he heard my mother tell what had happened to her, he was absolutely devastated at the thought that he could have actually killed her, which he could have done. Next picture, please. And you can go on to the next one, please. This is quite dark, but I hope you can see it clearly. This is the front cover of his logbook. It reads, Royal Air Force Navigators, Air Bombers and Air Gunners Flying Logbook, Flight Lieutenant Clarke. Next picture, please. And this shows you a page from his logbook. And the next picture will show you a line highlighted from that page, and it reads, on the 13th of the 2nd, 45, the 13th of February, 1945, 1740 hours, 20 to 6 in the evening, Lancaster, that was the aeroplane. And on the right-hand side, you can see the word Dresden. So he really could have killed her, but he didn't. At the end of March, the beginning of April of 1945, this is when the Germans were realizing they were losing the war. And this is when they began to evacuate the camps. They were trying to empty the camps of living witnesses as to what had happened inside the camps. And this is when the notorious death marches happened. My mother wasn't on a death march, but she was put on yet another train. And this time it didn't consist of cattle trucks. This time it consisted of coal wagons, open to the skies and filthy, and would have looked something like the next photograph, please. My mother was on a train like this for 17 days with no food and hardly any water. And after the war, when similar trains were discovered and opened up, they were discovered to just have piles of corpses in them. And during this 17-day nightmare of a journey, the train was stopped, the doors are open, the dead bodies thrown out. There were over 2,000 women on this train. And a farmer walked by and he saw my mother, and he had such a shock. She always said she could never forget the expression on his face. My mother described herself as looking like a scarcely living, pregnant skeleton. My mother weighed 5 stone, 35 kilograms, and she was 9 months pregnant. And this farmer brought her a glass of milk, but there was a Nazi officer standing near her, and he had a whip. And he raised this whip to shoulder height as if to beat my mother if she accepted the glass of milk. But he didn't. He didn't say anything. He lowered his arm and he let her have the glass of milk. She maintained that saved her life. Who knows? Perhaps it did. And the train went on. Next picture, please. And the train eventually arrived in this place called Mauthausen. Mauthausen itself is a beautiful village on the banks of the Danube in Austria near Linz. The concentration camp was up the very steep hill behind the village. And when my mother saw the name Mauthausen at the station, she had such a shock, because as opposed to when she'd arrived in Auschwitz not knowing what that was, this time she knew, because she had heard about this notorious place from very early on in the war. And she said the shock was so great that she always thought that it possibly provoked the onset of her labor. And she started to give birth to me on that coal wagon. She had to climb off the coal wagon, unaided. She had to clamber onto a cart because the prisoners were not strong enough to walk up the steep hill to the camp. They had to get onto carts and they were pulled up by others. She had people lying all over her, people with typhus and typhoid fever. And she proceeded to give birth to me. And there was another Nazi officer who saw that she was in the midst of child labor, and he said to her, "Du kannst weiter schreien," which means you can carry on screaming, because presumably she had been. And she always said that she was screaming not only because she was in labor, but because she thought this was her very last minute on this earth. She thought she was about to die. But we both survived the experience. I was born, I didn't move, I didn't breathe. Incredibly, the Germans allowed a doctor to come to my mother, a doctor who was also a prisoner. And presumably they allowed it because they could hear the guns in the distance. The doctor came, he cut the umbilical cord, and he smacked me to make me cry, to make me breathe. And there are 3 reasons why we survived. And the first is a very chilling one. On the 28th of April, 1945, the Nazis had run out of gas for the gas chamber. My birthday is the 29th. So presumably, had the train arrived on the 26th or 27th, again, I wouldn't be here today. The second indirect reason why we survived was because on the 30th of April, Hitler committed suicide. And the last and the best reason why we survived was because on the 5th of May, the American army liberated the camp. My mother reckoned she wouldn't have lasted much longer. They think I weighed 3 pounds. A 3-pound baby nowadays is put straight into an incubator. There were no incubators. Or perhaps I had the best incubator. My mother just held me all the time. And she was also able to feed me a little bit. Next picture, please. The main form of torture in Mauthausen was the fact that prisoners had to work all daylight hours in a stone quarry. And those are people on the left-hand side. They are carrying large blocks of stone that they've had to dig out of the quarry. And again, you have to remember, these are not young, strong, able-bodied people. These are prisoners who have been starved and tortured for months and years. And so many of them died or were killed on those steps that the prisoners themselves nicknamed them the Stairway of Death. They are very steep. I have seen them. I've even been on them. And in fact, this last year, on the 5th of May, I was meant to be going to Mauthausen for the 75th commemoration of the liberation. But because of COVID, it was cancelled, or at least it just went online. Next picture, please. Now, after liberation, this shows after liberation, when some of the prisoners who are strong enough, they're putting down the Nazi emblem, the eagle with the swastika underneath. What I also have to tell you is that when the Americans liberated the camp, they had food and they had medicine. But you may know that it is very, very dangerous to give starved people food because their bodies just cannot take it. And my mother spoke fluent English, and she tried to tell as many people as possible who didn't what the Americans were saying. And they were saying to eat very, very slowly and very small amounts. But you can imagine, can't you, that if you've been starved for months and years and suddenly you're handed an American chocolate Hershey bar, well, you tend to scoff the lot. And an awful lot of people at that stage collapsed and died. But one hopes that perhaps some of them, a few of them, might have realized that they were actually free. After about 3 weeks, when my mother was strong enough to travel, the Americans asked her if she wanted to be repatriated to Prague. She did. And so we were put on yet another train, an ordinary train this time. We arrived back in Prague. It was at night and it was dark. And my mother said that was the worst moment of her 3.5 years incarceration in camps. Because up to that moment, she'd never allowed herself to think as to what had probably happened to all the rest of the family. She just never let herself think about it. But, you know, arriving at your home station, you wonder if there might be anybody there to meet you. And of course there wasn't. But nevertheless, she still had a vestige of optimism at the back of her mind. And she thought that if any other member of the family had survived, there was a chance that it might be her cousin, the lady who received the postcard. And indeed she had. My Aunt Olga had come back from Terezin a few days before we returned from Mauthausen. And my aunt had even heard on the grapevine that my mother had survived, and that incredibly she had a baby. My mother asked somebody to give us some money to go on the tram, and we arrived at my aunt's flat. And my mother was a very practical woman, and the first words she said to my aunt were, "We haven't got any lice." Well, we were riddled with lice, and we had scabies, but she didn't think we had. And the second thing she said was, "Please, could we stay for a few days to recover?" Well, we actually stayed for 3 years. And that was amazing because we had our own family support group. It was a tiny family because we were almost the only survivors from what had been a very large extended family. And because my mother was given closure quite soon after the end of the war, when she was told of the death of my own father, so 3 years later, she was able to consider a new life and a new marriage. And this is where my stepfather comes into the story. Next picture, please. My stepfather, Karel Bergman, he was also Czech and also Jewish. Like my uncle, he'd managed to escape in 1939. He got to the UK. He joined the RAF. He was too old to be trained as a pilot, but because he spoke languages, he was made an official interpreter. And after the war, he came back to Prague to pick up the pieces of his family, most of whom had also been killed in Auschwitz. And he met my mother, whom he had known as a family friend before the war. And they decided to get married, and they also decided to leave because this was now 1948, and that is when the communists took over, and they did not want to live under a communist regime. And so we came to this country, and although we came legally, I would like to stress, we might have come as refugees. We might have come as asylum seekers. We might have come as migrants. We arrived in this country, and my stepfather got a job quite quickly in South Wales. I think the uniform probably helped. And as a result, I grew up in Cardiff. Next picture, please. And guess who? I know I've changed a bit, just slightly. I don't have plaits anymore. Well, I do have the plaits, but they're a different color. As you can see, this is a very happy picture. We're on our way to my first school prize giving, where my mother shed a lot of tears. Well, all parents and grandparents shed tears at prize givings, but I think she might have cried a bit more because unknown to her, I was about to receive a prize for reading, and I hadn't spoken a word of English the year before. But again, I'm sure you know that little children learn other languages very quickly. And then people say to me, oh, what did she look like in more recent times? So I wonder if you'll guess where we are when the next picture goes up, please. We're on the London Eye. When the London Eye opened, I asked my mother that year what she would like to do as a birthday treat. She was then 85. And she said, well, everybody's going on this London Eye. I want to go. So we did. And she thoroughly enjoyed it. And the next picture shows my mother 10 years later on her 95th birthday. Not bad for 95, huh? And my last photograph, next please, is my 4-generation photograph. I have 2 sons, and they have 3, now 4 children between them. And my mother could never get over the fact that she'd survived her wartime experiences, that I survived, and that she ended her life aged 96 with 3 great grandchildren. Now that is basically my story, but I want you to bear with me for one more minute while I tell you why I tell the story. I tell the story, first of all, for reasons of commemoration, to remember all those millions and millions of people who died, who were killed in the Holocaust. And especially all those people, we don't know the numbers, who've never ever had one single person remember them because all their families were killed and all their communities destroyed. And the only way the people live on is through our remembering of them. The second reason is just to tell you one family story, because as many as they are survivors, and they are a dwindling group nowadays, there are that many different stories, and they are all unique. They may have common elements, but they're all unique. The third reason is to try to enable us all to learn the lessons of the Holocaust. But just think about all the genocides since. Cambodia, Bosnia, Rwanda, Darfur, Syria, Myanmar, and now the Uyghurs in China. And the last reason is related. The last reason is to try to counteract racism and prejudice, any form of racism and prejudice. Now, while I have a drink, I would like you to relax. I would like you to perhaps think of some questions to ask me, and I would like to thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Eva, for that. It's a very powerful story to hear, and I know that many people in the chat have been really moved and inspired by what you've had to say. So yes, do take a well-deserved glug of drink there. What I just wanted to say first of all is that, you know, today is a very important day, and I am very grateful for those that have respected the forum of the chat with some comments, and I'm going to put some of those questions to you now. But what I would just say is that a lot of the recent feedback we've been getting on the chat has actually just been about how inspirational they find your story, and how inspirational they find both you and your mother. And it's been really lovely to see. So I'm just going to pick up some of the questions. And one of the questions that I saw was around resentment. And it was, quite honestly, do you feel resentment towards the Germans, or did you feel resentment, and for how long?
Right. Well, that's a question, in fact, that I'm always asked. And my mother always said, you can't live with hatred. You just can't. Because if you live with hatred and bitterness, you cannot move on. You cannot progress with your life. And although, obviously, she, all her life, she mourned the tragedy that had happened to our family, she never hated. I can give you an example of that. At least if I tell you on a lighter note, that when I was a teenager, I really put my parents to the test, because I actually went out with 3 German boys. Not all at the same time, but I did go out with 3 German boys. And my parents did not like it one little bit. But they never said anything. And also they appreciated that one cannot blame Germans of a younger generation, because they were not guilty. It would be totally unjust. And, so I went out to a party or cinema, normal stuff. And in a way, my mother found it sort of understandable, because she said to me, your father was German. My father considered himself first and foremost as a German, at least until 1933, when he found out differently. So no, you can't live with hatred and bitterness.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. A couple of the other questions that we're getting are around this idea of a sense of recovery, and questions perhaps around how long do you think it took for your mother and you to recover from the experience that your mother had in the camp, and and can you ever really fully recover from something like that?
Well, I have to say that my mother did. But it was partly her nature. The fact that she was able to talk about her experiences right from the start and very freely. Also, the fact she had an optimistic nature. But she said the main thing that helped her in her recovery was the fact that she had to live for me. She just had to get on with life because she was the only person I had. So she just had to get on with things. But I mean, we're all different, and different people react in different ways. But she did say that, yes, my existence helped her enormously to recover. And she says this, if I can give a plug, you might be interested to know that in 2012, the BBC did a documentary on my mother to mark her 95th birthday. And it is accessible on YouTube, and it's called The Baby Born in a Concentration Camp. And she actually says in that film that I helped her enormously to recover. And I have to say that, before the war, she had a very happy childhood and growing up. After the war, she had a very happy second marriage to my stepfather, and she was very glad to come to this country and start a completely new life after the war. And she was very happy here. It was partly in her nature, I think, that helped her. And also there was nothing for me to recover from. What is remarkable, though, is the fact that after her pregnancy, that I was born and I never had any physical or mental disability. You might have expected me to grow up with both, but I didn't.
Brilliant, thank you. There was also an earlier question when you talked about the yellow star and you showed your yellow star. One of the questions was there were other groups of people in the camps. What were they wearing similar stars, etc.? What were they having to wear?
There are tables that you can see in history books, and in fact, that map that I used right at the beginning, although it doesn't show it, but in the actual map in the book, which is one of Sir Martin Gilbert's maps. He's a very well-known historian of the Second World War and of Churchill. Anyway, the second half of that page shows all the different stars that existed. And I can't remember all of them, but for example, there were different stars for, certainly there were different stars for gay people. I think that was a pink star. I'm sorry, I just can't remember all the other ones, but there were several. There were half a dozen different stars. And it is something that you can look up, but I'm sorry, I just can't remember them now.
That's totally fine. That's totally fine. I think I'll just take one more question. Let's just pull this one up here. Again, it's all to do really with kind of like physical and kind of mental well-being. How do you feel that, you know, that's impacted on you throughout your life? Do you feel that, you know, your mental well-being has, you know, been affected by, obviously you were very, very tiny and have no recollection, no memory of this, but how has that impacted on your mental well-being?
That's an impossible question.
Yeah.
I don't know, because I am as I am. And I would hope that I would be as I am without this background. Obviously, it has had an influence on me. And, you know, I've always been incredibly proud of my mother, because all the credit is to her, it's not to me. And I've just considered myself very, very fortunate. I'm very grateful for everything in my life. And especially the fact that my mother was able to tell me about her experiences very gradually. Because I think if she had never said anything and sat me down one day and said, I've got something to tell you, it would have come as an enormous shock. But she told me very, very gradually. And that helped me, because I think I only realized perhaps when I was a young teenager, I began to realize the tragedy that had happened to our family.
So a real kind of emphasis and importance on kind of gradual and honest communication.
Yeah, that's right. And I've, you know, ever since I've been doing these talks, I've felt it's my duty to do. And I hope that through telling one family story, you know, everybody can identify with one family. Nobody can identify with 6 million.
Yeah.
But can I just do a recommendation as well?
Of course you can, Eva.
Well, forgive the sales pitch, but I feel honor bound. I highly recommend this book. It is called Born Survivors. It's by a former journalist, Wendy Holden. She was a war correspondent. She was in Iraq, amongst other places. And it tells the story of 3 young mothers, all of whom arrived in Auschwitz pregnant, all of whom were in the Freiburg slave labor camp for 6 months, all of whom were on that horrendous train journey for 17 days, all of whom gave birth in April of 1945 in the most dire of circumstances, and all 6 of us survived. All 3 mothers, all 3 babies, none of the fathers. I highly recommend it. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva. And I just want to, you know, thank you so much for your time today. We know that obviously Holocaust Memorial Day is a very special and poignant day. And I know that obviously you've got commitments to other events today. So we really do appreciate you taking time out of your busy day today to help us stop and reflect.
Can I add one more thing? Because I think that might appeal to people listening, and that is on the 60th anniversary. We're now on the 76th, but on the 60th anniversary, my mother and I attended a very big occasion. It was the first National Holocaust Memorial Day event, and she always was very pleased that through my work that she met the Queen.
Oh wow. Wow, that's quite something. That really is quite something. So once again, Eva, I just want to say thank you for today. I also just want to pay credit to the Holocaust Education Trust and the National Holocaust Museum, who have helped Eva over the years put together that presentation. So for some of the photographs that we've seen today, I want to say thank you to the tech people. Thank you to you at home who have joined in watching this. I'm very sorry that we had to turn the chat function off halfway through. We were getting inundated with comments. Some were really, really good questions. Some were going slightly off topic, so we did have to turn that off. But thank you for those that sent in some really respectful comments and questions for Eva. I'm sorry we couldn't get through all of them. There were hundreds. If you would like to know more about the book or about the documentary, we will send all that out in an email following this with a survey for you to fill in, and we will also be sending you information about some of our video workshops. If you found this session particularly useful, we do have an online session on anti-Semitism both in the time of the Holocaust but in modern days, that we could deliver to your class, to you, your students today at home. So if you would be interested in that, please express an interest when we send you an email following this session. But that is all from us today. So thank you ever so much for your time, and we wish you a very good rest of the day, and whatever else you may be doing for Holocaust Memorial Day, we hope that you enjoy that and take some time to reflect on today. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you.